June 1964, a shy 15-year-old schoolgirl waves goodbye to her grandparents and boards a train to school. Moments into the journey, she is savagely attacked with a broken bottle, dragged into a toilet, and her throat slashed in a frenzied, senseless murder. Her body is discovered by a screaming 12-year-old boy as the train races on. The killer slips away in the chaos, vanishing among 100 passengers. This is the brutal, unsolved, true story of Yvonne Laker, killed in broad daylight on an ordinary British train, and the man who walked free. Welcome to Crimes That Haunt Us. We release a new case every Sunday at 6 p.m, so hit subscribe and don't miss the next one. And let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. The summer of 1964 carried the promise of ordinary days, but on one ordinary afternoon aboard a southbound train, innocence was violently ripped away, leaving behind a crime that still echoes with unanswered questions more than 6 decades later. Yvonne Patricia Laker entered the world in 1949, the daughter of Peter Laker, a dedicated sergeant gunner serving with the RAF, and her mother, Ursula. The family was posted to Singapore, where they raised 3 children together. Yvonne's 2 younger brothers completed the picture. Christopher, 13 years old and enrolled at boarding school in Oxford, and little Robert, just 8, who stayed behind with the parents in Singapore. Yvonne, meanwhile, attended the Convent of the Nativity, a Roman Catholic boarding school nestled in Maidenhead. She had returned to English soil only 5 weeks before her death, having made the long journey back from Singapore. Those who knew her remembered a shy, dependable, and highly studious young girl whose quiet nature belied a bright and steady spirit. That final weekend of 27th of June, Yvonne enjoyed a cherished visit with her grandparents at their home on Dilly Lane in Barton, Hampshire. On the afternoon of the 29th of June, 1964, her grandparents lovingly captured a photograph of their cherished granddaughter, proudly planning to mail the image to her father, stationed far away in Singapore. Heartbreakingly, that single photograph remains the only surviving image of Yvonne, a gentle snapshot now forever tinged with loss. After the tender farewell, they drove her to Southampton terminus, reaching the station at 3:15 p.m. At 25 minutes past 3, Yvonne waved goodbye from her seat by the window as the train pulled out, sitting alone in the carriage. She was headed back toward her boarding school in Maidenhead and intended to change trains at Reading. The train arrived at Winchester Station at 3:55 p.m, where only a small number of passengers stepped aboard. When it departed again at 3:58 p.m, Yvonne remained seated by herself. During the trial of the man later accused of her murder, it would be claimed that he boarded at precisely this stop. At 4:03 p.m, the train had left Micheldever Station. Police would later conclude that it was moments afterward, while Yvonne was still sitting peacefully, that her attacker delivered a crushing blow to the left side of her head with a bottle. The glass shattered on impact, sending her into unconsciousness. In a scene of horrifying brutality, the killer then dragged her face down along the corridor and into the toilet compartment, where he used the jagged fragments to deliver a savage, fatal slash across her neck. As she lay bleeding out, her killer slipped away. At 4:22 p.m, the train then drew into Basingstoke Station amid a rush of passengers both boarding and alighting. Just 6 minutes after leaving Basingstoke at approximately 4:28 p.m, as the diesel engine continued its steady rumble along the tracks, young Michael Sapp, a 12-year-old member of a 4-boy train-spotting group from Bracknell who had boarded at Basingstoke shortly after departure, stepped into the lavatory. What he encountered sent him fleeing in screams of pure terror. After confiding in a male adult passenger what he had just observed, the man reacted swiftly by pulling the emergency cord, bringing the train to a shrieking halt. Demonstrating remarkable bravery for his age, Michael then jumped from the train and raced back to the station to fetch a doctor. The toilet compartment where Yvonne's body was discovered sat in the middle of the first carriage, accessible from both the first and second class sections. Tragically, the initial alert relayed to railway staff read only, "A girl has collapsed," creating a critical 11-minute window that may have allowed the killer to slip away unnoticed in the chaos following the grim find. The other roughly 100 passengers remained seated for those 11 long minutes until a relief train arrived to carry them forward to Reading. By the time investigators had arrived and confirmed that this was a cold-blooded murder, the passengers, and quite possibly the perpetrator among them, had already been transported elsewhere. It remains a chilling possibility that the killer could have possibly sat quietly among them, composure intact. When officers first entered the lavatory, they initially suspected suicide. Believing the girl might have fallen onto the razor, they moved her body while searching for it, but there was of course no razor. Detective Chief Superintendent Walter Jones of Hampshire CID took command of the investigation, deploying 70 officers and establishing a mobile headquarters right at Basingstoke Station. They managed to interview approximately 40 passengers in short order, yet around 20 others stayed unaccounted for, including one individual who had been traveling alone in the front coach. The painful duty of identifying Yvonne's body fell to her devastated grandfather. News of the horror then reached her parents in Singapore, prompting the RAF to arrange an immediate flight home for them. The train itself was swiftly withdrawn from service and shunted aside so forensics teams could begin their painstaking work. Shards of glass were recovered from the windowsill, from Yvonne's blue holdall bag, and from the very seat she had occupied, powerful evidence that the attack had begun while she was still seated. Directly behind her seat, officers found a brown paper carrier bag holding a bread roll wrapped in Midland-made packaging, a lettuce and cucumber sandwich, and a packet of half-eaten St. Michael biscuits, a brand available in any Marks & Spencer store. They theorized that this bag had been left behind by the killer. Investigators then traced the Midland-made bread to a farmhouse in Derbyshire and learned that this bread was only distributed exclusively in the Midlands region. They also came across scattered fragments of green broken glass littered the carriageway. Teams of officers accompanied by sniffer dogs conducted an immediate search of the railway line. The following day of searching, they recovered two crucial items of clothing: Yvonne's shoes and her school beret, discovered 2.5 miles further along near the small station of Micheldever. Additional searches turned up more matching green glass shards, which investigators increasingly believed had formed the weapon responsible for the frenzied, jagged wound to her neck. Notably absent, however, was the main portion of the broken bottle, especially the neck and label, which was never located despite thorough searches of both the crime scene and the tracks. Of the approximately 100 passengers aboard the three-carriage train, the majority were located and eliminated from suspicion. Police soon tracked down a couple from High Wycombe, a Mr. Brian and Miss Angelina Maria Lilly, who had travelled in the same carriage as Yvonne. They informed detectives that around 11 people had been present in the carriage when the emergency cord was pulled. Appeals continued for anyone else with information to come forward. On the 30th of June, Home Office pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson performed the post-mortem examination. He determined the cause of death to be shock and hemorrhage resulting from a 7-inch jagged cut to the throat. The wound appeared to have been delivered from behind, allowing the assailants to avoid significant blood transfer. A 2-inch cut accompanied by bruising ran along the left eye, consistent with blunt force trauma from the bottle strike. Dr. Simpson also observed signs that the attacker had covered Yvonne's mouth and nose with a hand, interfering with her breathing. There was no indication of sexual assault, and robbery was ruled out because her watch and the money in her purse had been left untouched. On July 1st, police publicly sought a man with a foreign accent in connection with the murder. He was described as wearing blue jeans and a red checked shirt, and officers appealed to publicans around the Winchester area to report any sightings of this man from that day. However, this suspect was soon definitively eliminated soon after this appeal. Detectives also appealed for a blonde woman dressed in a white dress, stating her right wrist had been in a cast and she had been travelling in Yvonne's carriage. She had transferred at Basingstoke onto a relief train bound for Reading and was reportedly accompanied by a youth who appeared to be her boyfriend. On July 4th, a man was then taken into custody and questioned overnight at Fulham Police Station on suspicion of Yvonne's murder, but he is subsequently released without charge after rigorous interrogation. By this point, CID officers had gathered 1,000 witness statements and fielded several thousand tips and letters. Further railway track searches between Basingstoke and Micheldever were organised in the continued hope of recovering the missing section of the murder weapon. On July 7th, news then emerged of yet another arrest, a man being held at a police station in the home counties. Officers then revealed through the press that they were now pursuing a solid line of inquiry as the suspect was transported to Basingstoke for further rigorous questioning. He would endure 13 hours of interrogation. The following day, July 8th, police then formally charged the man with Yvonne's murder. When informed of the charge, the man, revealed to be Derek Pye, responded, "I never touched the girl. This is a mistake." The accused man, 27-year-old unemployed farm labourer, Mr. Derek Pye of Hyde Road, Long Sutton, near Basingstoke, a married father of 3. He was then taken and led out the back of Basingstoke Police Station under cover of a blanket for an identity parade, during which point passengers from the carriage were also brought in to partake in the identity parade. The results of this identity parade are not known. However, Mr. Derek Pye is then brought into court for a 5-minute hearing where he is granted free legal aid before being remanded into custody. It would later emerge that Derek Pye had initially been detained in Aldershot on an unrelated charge of car theft. He had stolen a vehicle near his home and crashed it into a telegraph pole in Crondall, leading to his arrest. While awaiting court on that matter, a policeman discovered him sobbing in his cell. Pye then confessed his worry to the policeman, stating, "I am worried. I was on the train the girl was murdered on. I saw a man dragging her along the corridor to the toilet." He then described this other man as around 30 years old, with dark hair, wearing a white shirt and tie, and appeared very smart. When asked by the policeman how he had learned of the murder, Pye explained he had read about it in the Daily Mirror, but the paper's description of a packed train made him initially doubt it was the same service that he was on, since his own journey had been relatively empty. A further search of Pye's home after these revelations uncovered bottles of sherry strikingly similar to the suspected murder weapon in a shed, along with items of clothing that had contained broken glass shards in the pocket. On the strength of these discoveries, Derek Pye was then arrested and charged with Yvonne's murder. He would remain in prison on remand for the coming months until his trial began. The trial of Derek Pye then opened on the 26th of November 1964. The prosecution laid out its case, asserting that Pye had boarded the train at Winchester Station and sat either beside or opposite Yvonne. For reasons known only to him, it is alleged he then struck her on the left side of the head with such force with a bottle of sherry that it shattered the glass and rendered Yvonne unconscious. It is said he then dragged her down the corridor face down into the lavatory where he slashed her throat with a shard from the broken bottle. Afterward, he hurriedly left the train at Basingstoke Station, having first thrown Yvonne's berry and shoes out of the window shortly after passing Micheldever. The court then hears testimony from an Elizabeth Stewart Naydler of Farnham, who recounted that on the 2nd of July, just days after the killing, Derek Pye had appeared at her back door. Blood covered the left side of his face and his left hand and his shirt. He had claimed to her that he had been struck by a car that had failed to stop. She then offered to drive him to hospital. But en route, he had asked to stop at a public house where he used a payphone in the back to call his wife, after which he left and the woman never saw him again. It later became clear that Pye had not been the victim of a hit and run, but instead that he had crashed a stolen car into the telegraph pole in Crondall. The court also heard the account from the policeman who had found Derek Pye crying and agitated in his cell. Pye's earlier statement is then read out in court, in which he described seeing another man dragging the girl along the corridor to the toilet on that fateful train. In his written statement, Pye maintained his innocence in Yvonne's murder. He explained that, on the morning of the crime, he had visited his solicitor in Basingstoke. On the return journey, he purchased a ticket to the village of Winchfield, but had been directed to board the wrong train and ended up in Reading instead. He then caught another train back to Basingstoke and decided to visit the Royal Marine Recruitment Office in Winchester. And afterward, he then boarded the fatal train, sitting in the second carriage. Pye then claimed that upon emerging from the toilet, he saw a smartly dressed man holding up a girl wearing a school blazer, her face turned downward so he could not see it. When Pye asked the man what was wrong, the man replied that she had been sick. The man then took her into the toilet, emerging alone afterwards about 2 minutes later. Pye said he asked if she was alright now, only to be told it was none of his business. Pye said he went back to his carriage and thought nothing else of it until his stop at Basingstoke station, where he stepped off and went to the Grapes pub and bought a half bottle of Cuesta sherry. He then boarded another train back to Reading. From there, he says he took a 6 p.m. train to Hook, and from Hook he took a taxi to the village of Odingham, where he had left his bicycle. From there, he cycled home to his house on Hyde Road, Long Sutton, arriving at around 8:30 p.m. The prosecution countered by stating that an old school friend of Pye's had seen him at Reading train station much later on, at around 7:30 p.m. They also state that they were unable to find any taxi drivers in Hook who had given him a lift to Odingham. Pye maintained his version of events. The prosecution dismissed this account, arguing that Pye had in fact invented this mysterious stranger to deflect blame. Then a Scotland Yard scientist testified about examining a broken green glass fragment recovered from the right pocket of a blue and white suit belonging to Mr. Pye. After analysing dozens of similar fragments, he was able to reconstruct part of the base of a Cuesta sherry bottle and expressed the opinion that the shard could possibly have come from the murder weapon. The judge pointed out, however, that no blood was found on the jacket and there was no evidence proving Derek Pye had even been wearing it on the day in question. Next to testify was train porter Nigel Gulliver, who confirmed encountering Derek Pye at Winchester City Station. He claims Pye had arrived on a train from Waterloo via Basingstoke, but had been directed onto the wrong service, so Gulliver allowed him aboard the murder train at Winchester. Gulliver also recalled seeing Yvonne sitting alone at the end of the carriage and was certain other passengers were present. Derek Pye then gave evidence in his own defense, repeating his claim that another man had been on the train and had dragged Yvonne into the toilet. He described the man as approximately 30 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, dark-haired and clean-shaven, wearing a dark brown sports jacket with coloured flecks, dark trousers and a white or cream shirt. Pye insisted he was not responsible and told the jury he would have protected Yvonne had she sought his help. Under cross-examination, he held firmly to his story, denying he had heard any disturbance or seen the other man leave the train. He added that he had noticed pieces of broken glass on the floor and decided to pick them up and throw them out the window because they posed a danger to other passengers. Later in the proceedings, a tractor driver came forth with striking testimony. Ronald Kenneth Bridges had been cutting a field of hay near Basingstoke Station around 4:30 p.m. on the afternoon of the murder when he observed a man walking away from the railway tracks. He described the man as of average build, in his 20s, with brush-back hair, wearing a dark jacket and trousers. The man appeared to be carrying something in his hand, though Bridges could not make out what it was. Importantly, Bridges stated the man he saw was not Derek Pye. Another witness, Joseph Discipline, also testified to seeing a man in his early 30s with fair hair and a reddish complexion standing suspiciously about a quarter of a mile from the tracks in a side road. Mr. Justice Streatfeild then delivered his summing up, outlining the facts from both the prosecution and defense. He reminded the jury that no pressure was upon them and that they must decide whether the evidence proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt. If so, they must convict Derek Pye of murder. There was no verdict of manslaughter available. The judge then went on to observe the fact that few men had endured such intense interrogation as Derek Pye over 13 hours. He then reminds them that Mr. Pye had maintained his account consistently from start to finish. He drew the jury's attention to the tractor driver's description of a man acting suspiciously near the tracks soon after the murder, and that the description of the man had closely resembled the stranger Derek Pye had portrayed. Finally, he cautioned the jury against allowing the barbarity of the crime to cloud their judgment. If they believed Pye was telling the truth, then they were duty-bound to acquit him. The jury was then sent away to consider the verdict. And after 6.5 hours of deliberation, on the evening of the 1st of December 1964, they returned with a verdict of not guilty for Derek Pye. Although cleared of the murder, Derek Pye remained in custody facing 10 separate unrelated charges, including arson, burglary, and a GBH assault on his wife, Eileen. These charges had been withheld from the jury to avoid any risk of prejudice. He was remanded back into prison pending those trials and would ultimately be convicted on the arson and burglary charges, receiving an 18-month prison sentence. The wounding with intent charge against his wife never did proceed to trial. Pye would soon be convicted again upon his release, this time again for burglary and the theft of a car. The court heard that while inside the property, he had slashed a woman's undergarment. When arrested, he claimed a man in a pub had simply given him the car. This time, the jury did not believe him. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison. His defense solicitor pleaded with the judge to allow Pye treatment whilst in jail for his alcoholism, conceding that it was the root cause of most of his clients' offending. Pye would continue his brushes with the law up until his own death in 1981 at the age of just 44. The acquittal of Derek Pye left the murder of Yvonne Laker unsolved. No other credible suspect ever surfaced. It is not known whether police continued to search for anyone else. In an era before DNA profiling and CCTV surveillance, and with the killer likely having escaped at Basingstoke or perhaps ferried onwards to Reading, the investigation ultimately ground to a halt, leaving a devastated family and a lingering shadow over that fateful train journey. Yvonne Patricia Laker was just 15, a shy, studious girl who had only been back in England for 5 short weeks. She never did make it to her boarding school that day. Her young life was stolen in a moment of senseless brutality, leaving her family forever broken and a case that remains unsolved for more than 60 years. May she rest in peace, and may she be remembered not for the horror that ended her life, but for the gentle, reliable daughter and granddaughter she was. Thank you for watching and listening to Yvonne's story. Please feel free to add your own thoughts, comments, and theories down below, and we'll see you next time.